the lymphatic system. This is the first video in a series of videos that we will put up to go over the lymphatic system. Pathogens are microscopic organisms that cause diseases. This would include things like parasites, fungi, bacteria, and viruses. The lymphatic system's job is to protect us against these diseases. The cells of the lymphatic system will be able to respond to cancers or abnormal body cells, pathogens, and even toxins. Lymphocytes are cells that are part of the immune response and will identify, attack, and develop immunity to pathogens. Immunity is your body's ability to resist those infections and diseases, and all of your body's tissues and cells will be a part of producing immunity. So not just the lymphatic system alone. All the systems are going to contribute to helping you produce immunity. So the parts of the lymphatic system are going to include any lymphoid tissues and organs that are scattered throughout the body. Lymphatic vessels that will carry lymph from the peripheral tissues to the deeper veins. Lymph is fluid that is very similar to plasma but does not have the proteins. Lymphoid cells as well, which is going to include phagocytes and other types of cells that we will eventually get to. So here's a good picture of the lymphatic system, and right away we can definitely see these little nodules, which are the different lymph nodes located throughout the body. We've also got the thymus, which we'll talk about, tonsils, spleen, and the cisterna chyli, which we will talk about a little bit later. Then you've got all the vessels running up and down through the body carrying this lymphatic fluid. Lymphocytes are produced in the primary lymphoid tissues and organs, as well as in the red bone marrow and also the thymus. We are going to talk about the thymus a little later, but here it is again, right here, the thymus. Lymphocytes are activated in the secondary lymphoid tissues and organs, as well as the tonsils, MALT, which stands for mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue, lymph nodes, and the spleen. So that's a general overview of the components of the lymphatic tissue. But the summary you should take from this slide is that lymphocytes will first be created in the primary tissues and organs, and then they'll be activated. So they become active in the secondary lymphoid tissues and organs. So the lymphatic system will produce, maintain, and distribute lymphocytes and other important lymphoid cells. In addition, it's going to help us to maintain our normal blood volume and assist us in returning fluid to the bloodstream and transport nutrients, waste, and also hormones. The lymphatic vessels are going to carry the lymph, which again is that interstitial fluid that has entered the lymphatic vessels from the peripheral tissues to the venous system. So this is a view of a lymphatic vessel. Lymphatic vessels are often called lymphatics. They carry lymph from the peripheral tissues to the venous system, as we just mentioned. The lymph again is that fluid that has entered the lymphatic vessels, which vary in size. Lymph will first enter lymphatic capillaries and then drain into larger, major lymph collecting vessels known as trunks and ducts. From the lymphatic capillaries, lymph will flow into larger lymphatic vessels that will lead toward the body's trunk. The walls of these vessels are going to have 3 layers comparable to those of veins. Small and medium-sized lymphatic vessels also contain valves. So you can see this simple image here includes the valves that are in these lymphatic vessels. The valves are pretty close together and do produce noticeable bulges on the outside of the lymphatic vessel. So some lymphatic vessels will have a beaded appearance due to an irregular lumen. Okay, reminder that the lumen is the hollow inside of an organ or a vessel. The valves will prevent backflow of lymph within the lymphatic vessels, especially in your arms and legs. Pressure in the lymphatic system is very minimal, so the valves are super important to maintain normal lymph flow toward the thoracic cavity. Contractions of your muscles surrounding the lymphatic vessels will help with this lymph flow. Lymphatic capillaries are different from blood capillaries in a few ways. For one, they have larger luminal diameters. Again, lumen, the hollow inside of the capillary. They are closed at one end rather than forming a continuous tube. They have thinner walls, and they are flat or irregular when we look at them in sectional view. They are lined by endothelial cells, but the basement membrane is incomplete or absent. The endothelial cells of a lymphatic capillary are not bound tightly together, but they do overlap. So let's look at a picture of that, and we're going to go forward just a little bit. So in this picture here, we've got a lymphatic capillary, and you can see where the endothelial cells sort of overlap one another. This is going to leave some small gaps, like we can see here, and also here, and here. The region of overlap acts as a one-way valve. So this is going to actually permit fluid and solutes, including proteins, to squeeze through those little gaps. We can, in addition, have viruses, bacteria, and also cell debris enter in through these little gaps, but it does prevent them from returning to the intercellular spaces. So they can get in, but they can't get out. So it's a little bit like a trap. Lymphatic capillaries are found in almost every tissue and organ in your body. There's even some that we talk about in the digestive system known as lacteals. These are going to transport lipids absorbed by the digestive tract. So here's what we just talked about when we looked at that image. The endothelial cells loosely bound together, giving us those little gaps, which are one-way valves. So we can have those things, those viruses, bacteria, solutes, proteins enter, but prevent them from returning to the intercellular spaces, which is pretty awesome. Lymph flows from the lymphatic capillaries, which are the smallest, to larger lymphatic vessels that contain the one-way valves we just looked at. As we mentioned before, lacteals found in the small intestine. Lymphatic vessels are going to include superficial lymphatics, and then we've got the deep lymphatics. So superficial lymphatics are located in the subcutaneous layer deep to the skin. Also found in areolar tissue of mucous membranes, like in the digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts. Deep lymphatics are larger lymphatic vessels that accompany deep arteries and veins that supply skeletal muscle and other organs of the neck, limbs, trunk, and walls of visceral organs. The superficial and deep lymphatics are going to converge or join together to form even larger vessels called lymphatic trunks. The trunks empty into two large collecting vessels, the thoracic duct and the right lymphatic duct. The thoracic duct. The base will expand to form cisterna chyli, which will receive lymph from the right and left lumbar trunks and the intestinal trunk. The inferior segment will collect lymph from the left bronchomediastinal trunk, the left subclavian trunk, and the left jugular trunk. This will empty into the subclavian vein. The right lymphatic duct will collect lymph from the right jugular trunk, the right subclavian trunk, and the right bronchomediastinal trunk. This will empty into the right subclavian vein. So here's a little overview of what we've talked about so far, and we're going to also look at it in an image. So we've got the lymphatic capillaries that will flow to the lymphatic vessels, of which there are superficial and deep. Then we go into the lymphatic trunks, then into the ducts, which we have the thoracic duct, and we have the right lymphatic duct. The thoracic duct carries lymph from tissues inferior to the diaphragm and from the left side of the upper body. The smaller right lymphatic duct carries lymph from the rest of the body. At the base of the thoracic duct is an expanded sac-like chamber called the cisterna chyli. The cisterna chyli will receive lymph from the inferior part of the abdomen, the pelvis, and the lower limbs. And this is by way of the right and left lumbar trunks and the intestinal trunk. So we have the lumbar trunks and we have the intestinal trunk. The inferior segment of the thoracic duct lies anterior or in front of the vertebral column. From the second lumbar vertebra, it passes posterior to the diaphragm alongside the aorta, and then it's going to ascend along the left side of the vertebral column to the level of the left clavicle. It's going to collect lymph from the left bronchomediastinal trunk, the left subclavian trunk, and the left jugular trunk. Okay, so here's the left jugular trunk, the left subclavian trunk, and the left bronchomediastinal trunk. And it will empty into the left subclavian vein, which is here. Lymph will re-enter the venous circulation from the left side of the head, neck, and thorax, as well as from the entire body inferior to the diaphragm. The right lymphatic duct is formed by the merging of the right jugular trunk, the right subclavian trunk, and the right bronchomediastinal trunk. This duct will empty into the right subclavian vein, delivering lymph from the right side of the body superior to the diaphragm. Lymphedema is defined as a blockage of lymph drainage from a limb, which can cause severe swelling and interfere with immune function. Lymphoid cells are immune system cells and support cells of the lymphoid tissues. Lymphocytes are going to make up about 20 to 40% of the circulating leukocytes. Most of these are stored and not circulating. The types of lymphocytes. We have T cells, which are thymus dependent, B cells, which are bone marrow derived, and NK cells, which are the natural killer cells. So those abbreviations are all pretty straightforward. Lymphoid tissues are connective tissues dominated by these lymphocytes. Lymphoid nodules are areolar tissue with a lot of lymphocytes. The germinal center of the lymphoid nodule contains the dividing lymphocytes, which will be distributed in the lymph nodes, spleen, tonsils, digestive, urinary, and reproductive tracts. So here are the germinal centers in purple. So this is where the lymphoid nodule will contain dividing lymphocytes. Mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue, or MALT, is lymphoid tissue associated with the digestive system. Grouped up lymphoid nodules are in clusters deep to the intestinal epithelium. The appendix is going to contain a mass of fused lymphoid nodules. And lymphoid organs are also going to include the spleen, thymus, and the lymph nodes. They're separated from the other tissues around by a fibrous connective tissue capsule. So let's talk about the components of the lymph nodes. So here's a few terms, and then we'll look at them in an image. So we've got trabeculi, which are bundles of collagen fibers that move from the capsule into the interior of the lymph node. Trabeculi. So the typical lymph node is shaped a bit like a kidney bean, which we can see here. So we just talked about the germinal center and the trabeculi. This would be an example here. It's not labeled in this picture, but this is a bundle of collagen that extends from the capsule into the interior of the node. So this would be one, here would be another, and there would be another. The hilum. The hilum is the indentation where the blood vessels and nerves join the lymph node. So that would be here. This is that little indentation where blood vessels and nerves join the lymph node. You can see it's here in this image. Afferent lymphatics are going to bring lymph to the lymph node from the peripheral tissues. The afferent lymphatics will penetrate the capsule of the lymph node on the side opposite of the hilum. So here's our afferent lymphatic vessels on the side opposite of the hilum. Remember, afferent in the nervous system, afferent is accessing. So this is bringing lymph to the lymph node. And efferent lymphatics leave the lymph node at the hilum. These vessels are carrying lymph away from the lymph node towards the venous circulation. So here's our efferent lymphatic vessel. Lymphatic flow through the nodes. Lymph from the afferent lymphatics, and so remember that's going to be these guys. Here's one here, and there's one here, is going to flow through the lymph node within a network of sinuses, open passageways within complete walls. The lymph node interior is divided into an outer cortex. So there's our outer cortex. This is under the collagen capsule and under the subcapsular space, which is this white area right here. We've also got an inner medulla. Here's our medulla in gray, the medulla in gray, and then we've got the paracortex, which is between the two. So paracortex here, going around. Okay, so we've got the collagen capsule, subcapsular space. Then we have the cortex, the paracortex, and the medulla in gray. So lymph will first enter the subcapsular space, which is white, that contains macrophages and dendritic cells. Dendritic cells are important because they're going to start an immune response. Lymph will pass through the subcapsular space and then flow through the cortex of the node. Okay, so we're going to move from here and flow through the cortex of the node. The cortex contains B cells within germinal centers. B cells within germinal centers, similar to those of lymphoid nodules. Lymph will then continue through the lymph sinus towards an area known as the paracortex. So here's our paracortex we looked at before. The paracortex is dominated by T cells. Here, lymphocytes will leave the bloodstream and enter the lymph node by crossing the walls of blood vessels. After flowing through the sinus of the paracortex, lymph continues into the core or the medulla. The medulla contains B cells and macrophages. Elongated masses of dense lymphoid tissue between the sinuses in the medulla are known as medullary cords. So here is a medullary cord. Lymph will pass through a network of sinuses in the medulla and then enter the efferent lymphatics at the hilum. So we're going to go through here, through the efferent lymphatic of the hilum. So again, we've got the collagen capsule. We're going to enter in the subcapsular space where there are macrophages and dendritic cells, then into the outer cortex that contains B cells, through the paracortex where there are T cells, into the medulla, which is here in gray. This is where we've got B cells and macrophages, and then finally into the efferent lymphatics at the hilum. So what do lymph nodes really do? They're going to purify the lymph before returning it to the venous circulation by removing 99% of antigens, which is super impressive. Antigens released due to infection enter the lymph and stimulate the macrophages and lymphocytes in the lymph nodes. The antigens will also be carried by dendritic cells to the lymph nodes. Lymphoid tissues and lymph nodes will also monitor peripheral infections and respond before the infections reach vital organs. Awesome. Lymph nodes of the gut, lungs, thoracic duct, and trachea will protect against pathogens in the digestive and respiratory tracts. The largest lymph nodes are found in the axillae, which is the base of the neck and groin, and will swell in response to infection. Lymphadenopathy is described as chronic or excessive enlargement of the lymph nodes and can indicate cancer or infection. So here you can see the lymph nodes really clearly behind the ear. So on to the thymus. The thymus is found in the mediastinum. So a quick reminder of what we mean when we say mediastinum. So the mediastinum is a central tissue mass that is going to divide the thoracic cavity into a left and a right pleural cavity. It begins to shrink after puberty. The thymus begins to shrink. It's divided into two thymic lobes, and a septa or a wall will divide the lobes into smaller lobules. The thymic lobule has a dense outer cortex and a pale central medulla. Lymphocytes divide in the cortex and will migrate into the medulla. Mature T cells leave the thymus by medullary blood vessels. So reminder again, and we're going to repeat these things quite a bit, but cortex is the outermost part of an organ. And then we've got the medulla, which is the inside part or the deepest part of the organ. And we are making in the thymus T cells. So T, thymus. So here's the thymus gland. Remember, it starts to shrink after puberty, and it does have a wall in it that divides it into a left and a right lobe.